So I'm sitting here with Wes, the CEO of Eli5. We are talking about replacing legacy software as part of the software modernization proposition we have at Eli5. And in particular, we focus on the business critical systems that need to be replaced that have been built like 10, 15 years ago because of a variety of reasons, such as limited or no API capabilities for integrations or running on infrastructure that's no longer supported by the vendors, or maybe that the business logic that it contains has been poorly documented and is no longer understood by the current employees. So, as part of the Eli5 content series, in which we explain complex topics, we're talking about replacing these systems. And today I'm talking with Wes about his role in replacing these systems as as I know him as a very good product developer, digital product developer. So we are focused particularly on the UX and UI in this case of these legacy systems or replacing the legacy systems. So Wes, have you seen in the last years that the emphasis on UX and UI in these business critical systems has more importance than it had? Or what's your take on that? Have you seen a shift in importance or?
Importance of UX and UI in terms of internal tooling. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, exactly. So as a business critical, most of the times maybe back-end systems or at least back office
hmm
systems, I have to say.
hmm
Is it still
Yeah,
the
I do.
same
I do
or?
see there's a big difference I see between multi-tenant products and single-tenant products. Often with the latter, I'd say there's a lot less attention to UI, UX, which makes sense. But in the end, you still need people to work with it, right? So and I think in terms of systems that have been built over the last decade, I think you often also run into certain foundation that you build in terms of design that is eventually blocking the ability of adding features in the way you'd like to add them in the most frictionless way, I'd say. It's just like when you build let's say a manufacturing business, and they start with like one building that all is working perfectly fine, but then all of a sudden they want to add stuff to the production and build like a little thing against the production facility, and that's then purposed for something else, and so on, and eventually you have like this thing that doesn't work optimal, right? I think it's the same with lots of the legacy software. I think overall people can spend a lot more time on UX UI, even if it's only like a product that's only running for one organization.
And so in terms of like, of course, like UX and UI cost money. When we would do a project at Eli 5, design of a system, of course, is included in the project. But the more emphasis on the UX, the more it would cost, I would say. UX UI investment. Do you think a management or an executive would consider that as like, yeah, we're going to make it pretty, rather than seeing it as a sort of strategic investment where return on investment is also sort of guaranteed, as maybe users would be more efficient or effective? Do you think that shift is coming, that there is a sort of understanding of the importance and the return on investment on UX and UI?
Well, let's say if you would start a project right now doing just that, then it would definitely not be smart to not look at it. I think it's becoming easier and easier to make the aesthetics of the product, make them super smooth. And with a little bit of thinking, you can also make the experience super smooth. So if you start now, I definitely would suggest looking at it, spending a lot of time on it. But I also understand it's often the CEO who decides, right? And basically he decides that his people or her people are working with the tool. Um, and the contrast with a multi-tenant tool, SaaS tool, is that if you don't have it on point, then you probably get a lot less customers, or customers start walking away, etc. So yeah, how do you create that awareness within the person that is deciding this? Often the CEO in most cases. Um, Yeah, I find that one difficult. I mean, but speaking from my perspective, yeah, I would always always take a look at it. A lot of people don't care, but again, it's so easy to do it right nowadays. You do need to spend time on it, but it would be silly not to do it.
So in terms, I think
But
you
it,
can almost see it as a business case also, right? If like an old, and especially with the legacy systems where you say, yeah, you have 20 clicks to get to somewhere instead of like having four or
mm,
five, which we have seen in projects that were like
yeah,
ideas of, or at least suggestions of people like, okay, we need to reduce the amount of clicks so it costs us less
mm,
time and therefore we are
mm,
more effective and therefore you have a positive return on investment or at least a good business case to change the tool. Would that make sense to go into like business case modeling or is that like yeah, overdone?
yeah. Okay, well, I think now you're referring to quite an extreme case that you and I both have been involved in, which was for a government. And that specific part of the government had to process certain applications. Yeah, when we looked at that flow, how that worked, that was incredibly bad. You know, you could see that it was grown like over the last decade. Employees had to click a lot of times. They couldn't really navigate back to stuff that they already filled in earlier in the process. And, I mean, it was just super clunky. And I think, okay, if you got an extreme case like that, I think then you can actually create a very valid business case for, in this case, that department of the government. Because that would just be checking like how much time does it cost now for employees to go through that entire flow. Maybe even take a look at like how many applications they are not even completing, because I think that was also the case because they just couldn't do certain things, and then compare that to a flow that is designed from scratch and see how much time it's saving. I think in that way you can definitely create a proper business case. So you know, there's a difference between something just being a little bit clunky and something just being bad, right? And I think that was the case in this with this project. But if it's just clunky, yeah, I can understand that people just don't do it. You know, like I'm like, yeah, it's fine, it's clunky. Maybe we save 1 minute per application in this case. I can understand people in the lead thinking, okay, yeah, it doesn't matter. But yeah, definitely, if the case is as severe as this one, then you can easily just yeah make the business case like this is how it's going now, and this is what it could be. And if you multiply that with the amount of employees working with it or the amount of projects that they're doing with it, then yeah, you got a clear business case.
Right, that makes sense. And I like the divide that you make between like internal tools that maybe have like less relevance, or at least not per se relevance, but where you can emphasize the UX UI a bit less, opposed to SaaS tools where you are like in competition, maybe even when it comes to
Yeah.
like UX UI, because people will just leave you if it's ugly or the workflow doesn't like completely work. And going maybe a bit more into detail on like the internal systems, like the single tenant system, so to speak. I also wonder if you have a legacy system where it needs to be replaced because of reasons as like connectivity or automation or an AI
Mm.
that is not able to do. So it needs to be replaced, and UX UI is one component of the replace. Yeah, it needs to also be updated. But how do you? What's your take on like the habit of a person that works in the legacy system and has a certain flow and is accustomed to that maybe UX, the ugly experience or the ugly interface, so to speak,
Mm.
maybe in our words more than theirs. But if you're going to update the whole product and you also overhaul the aesthetics of the internal tool, that could also really affect adoption, I would argue. What's your take on like keeping it as it is, sort of, and then do minor updates, or what's your first thoughts on that?
Um, yeah, I think that one depends very much on the organization. Let's say if you got like 100 people working with it, and you know for sure that the upcoming 5 years is the same 100 people working with it, then I think the case is a little bit different. So if you have 100 people that are so used to working with a tool that works a certain way, then you be careful, right? But let's say if you got a team of 100 people working with it, but the people working with it just come and go, then I think it's more relevant, right? Because then you also want to make sure it can be a tool that does a lot of things, but that's not a reason to make it very complex. So if you can make the onboarding for new employees way smoother, easier, then I think that's your game. But you will always have people within the organization that will probably have some difficulty with moving from the old one to the new one because they're so like used to that way of working. And that's also the difference between multi-tenant and single tenant tools, right? Because I think often when a single tenant tools gets a massive overhaul, then it's very abrupt. But most multi-tenant SaaS tools, it's often gradually because they want to make sure, okay, let's not do too much that users are all of a sudden surprised with things, you know. I think one thing that works very well is to, yeah, at least talk to some people of those 100 employees and let them weigh in on how things need to work, right? That they also feel they own it a little bit. But yeah, it's definitely a tough one, especially if we go back to the government project we were just talking about. Those were not the most tech savvy people. And I think it probably took some time for them to get used to the tool as it is working currently. They need to be careful with moving that into a completely renewed product. So in that case, I would not try anything on the cutting edge of how things can work, right? So be a little bit more conservative, so to say.
Have you ever had in one of your projects that like the resistance of the users derailed the project?
Mm, yeah, but that was mostly from higher up. So what most enterprise internal tooling that I've been part of, I mean, I've been part of like many, and like some were done with like a very small team, but I've also been in project that have been set in like a boardroom with 18 other people, and everyone wanted to weigh in on how the product should work, etc. So if you end up in those situations, then you got to be very strong to avoid this mix of very average opinions, so to say, that eventually you just get a product that's just meh. But from the users themselves, I always leverage that for input on how to make the product better. Not saying that you need to listen to them 100% of the time, but they often give you a very good direction of what you need to do to make them happy.
Right. Makes sense. Makes sense. Um, like maybe a bit like off topic in a way, but when a company needs to decide on like, okay, we're going to replace this custom built system that has been built like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, needs to be replaced, they have a decision to make. If they made the decision to replace, they can either then buy something off the shelf, hopefully that would always be better, I assume, but that opinion I will also leave to you. You can build something with building blocks, you know, like try to have a low code solution, or you can have something completely custom in a way, which is the domain of Eli5, but still we also use building blocks, obviously, speeds up the process. Is that a difficult decision in terms of, yeah, maybe it's very clear in some ways, off the shelf building blocks or custom design, but what's your take on that when a company replacing or modernizing the systems, what should they look at when doing this?
I think it's definitely a good thing to do to explore what's in the market because you probably built that tool like 10 years ago. There's a good chance that there's quite some stuff being offered that's just SaaS or off the shelf stuff. I do think with a lot of enterprise tooling that we are dealing with, that there's like something in the middle is a sweet spot, right? So you are not bound to the boundaries of SaaS and off the shelf, but you also don't want to end up in like a fully custom software project. So from what I've seen, the projects that I like most is where we could leverage a lot of our building blocks. So let's say if we would now build like a regulatory tech product for a bank or an insurance company, whatever, we have like all these building blocks within RegTech that we can leverage to build a fully custom solution for that company. So you want to have the freedom to build a tool the way it is best for your organization. But yeah, if possible, definitely do that based on battle tested, already existing components, right? I think that's by far the best way forward. Again, do some proper research prior to building. Like if there's something out there that does 90% of what it needs to do, then you gotta, yeah, you got a trade-off to make. Like, is it worth that 10% to do something with a company like Eli5? Or is it fine to just go with that off the shelf SaaS tooling that does 90% of what I need to have? I mean, that's ideal, I think, a situation like that for the organization, of course, but that's not what we run into most, because they often have things more like 60% of what we need to do is done with this SaaS tool. But yeah, that doesn't cut it for us. So yeah, I think if you end up in a situation like that and you're looking for a partner, then I would definitely go for someone that has already a lot of existing technology within the domain, right? So you can just work a lot faster.
So it makes sense to maybe for the companies searching for custom builds, when they acknowledged that that is the way to go, to search for companies that can prove that they have certain building blocks already in stock, so to speak, right? You never see that, or at least you cannot really see that from their websites. So you need to talk to them, interview them, specifically ask these questions, actually. You need to be educated on that then.
Yeah, but I mean, even companies that have it, because lots of companies have it, they rather just build it again because it's better for their revenue, right?
Yeah, right.
So yeah, it's a tricky game because there's so many companies out there that have all this IP already, but they just want to charge the 100% as if they are building it from scratch. I think definitely look for companies that have it, and then yeah, secondly, also look at their philosophy on building. Right? Would they rather just build as much as possible, or would they rather just work as fast as possible and get the thing done ASAP without losing quality, of course?
Right. And in a way, it could be interesting also for agencies like Eli5, so for studios like Eli5, to maybe think about different ways of revenue, in the sense that, okay, we have this building block, we can reuse it, we just charge the client a licensing fee instead of them paying us to build it again. So that is also, of course, something that needs to be considered by the product studios themselves, right?
I think if you make like a proper case for it, and you also give the client the decision, I think I mean, obviously they rather want to just pay per use or pay per month instead of like spending 50K on a feature or something. Like I think that's evident. But the enterprise clients I work with this way, so this more hybrid way of working, they just want to have more like a lump sum deal, like, so we pay this much and then it's just ours. But yeah, I mean, in that case, you also charge for it, of course, but you don't have to do the work anymore, so you can do it cheaper. Obviously, if you can add some kind of like pay-per-use model in the contract, that's super nice to have.
Yeah. Okay, back to the UX UI a bit. The developers already have a lot of AI assistants in their day-to-day work when it comes to developing products and doing quality and security assessments. From the perspective of the product designer, obviously the past 5 years, giant leaps have been made in terms of tooling that you are now using when designing a product. What do you expect from the near future and maybe a bit more out when it comes to AI supported UX UI design and workflow design and that kind of stuff?
I mean, there's already a lot of things that we apply. So wireframing used to take quite some time. That's basically now done with text prompts. That's already a massive gain. I think you can use tools like Lovable, for example, to ideate user interfaces. Not saying that you should then use the interface that Lovable is outputting, but it's definitely a nice tool to ideate on interfaces. And I think Figma also now does that with Figma Make, right? You basically just go from text to UI. So definitely use that. I think in the other company that we have next to Eli5, which is NoCo, they are more focused on designing websites for SaaS and tech companies. And what I see happening there looks very promising, but we cannot really apply that to the fullest within product design yet. But yeah, they got tools like Framer that they are now embracing, where basically the designer can make 90% of the website, whereas with tools like Webflow, you still need to have a lot of the projects still required a lot of development, less than when you do it custom, but still quite some. And I also see them tinkering with tools Like there's now an integration between Figma and Claude, I believe, where you can leverage that to develop the interface as you designed it in Figma. So there's quite some stuff happening, and I think what I see happening in NoCo will later on also be applicable in Eli5 in most cases. So I think going from product design to a developed user interface, I see more and more AI popping up there that will definitely make us go way faster. It's just a little bit more complex than designing a website, right?
Yeah, and I think before the moment that the AI or the language model understands the context and the business complexity and the business rules, which is, yes, it's quite heavy in most of these enterprise systems, of course. So that will take a while, I suppose. But looking at, for example, what the CEO of Microsoft said about the AI agent replacing the sort of a part of the enterprise systems in terms of making easy, very personal and custom interfaces possible, I would say that is quite a long way ahead for us, right? It's not that that comes in next year or something.
Yeah, I'm not that afraid of it. I mean, I would embrace it even. I think there's still the contrast between more like the, how do you call that? Like the regular software development agencies that just build whatever the client is asking, and those companies that are actually in the lead of like thinking about how this product should work, how is it serving the customer the best way possible. I think that contrast will only grow. And in the end, these clients still pay you for inventing a solution for that problem. I mean, as much as AI can take away from that, can unburden us with certain things, it still needs to happen in the right way. And also from what I see in lots of stuff that we are building, for now, the best case for a lot of use cases, I still think is a human in the loop AI. Even if you look at like our content development process, you know, if you would let AI do that completely, they get quite crappy content. But if you basically mimic the process of how we are creating content, and you still let the human decide along the way, then you come to like 80, 90% of how we would write it ourselves. And I think it's the same, like take regulatory compliance, for example. I don't think there's a single bank that would like to have an AI doing their compliance work. But yeah, if you would do that more according like a human in the loop approach, then I think you can save a lot of time within compliance as well without losing quality. So I think what you're saying is still, it's definitely coming, something like that. But even if it's there, it still requires clear thinking and ideation and going into the nitty gritty of how a certain thing works and how a certain thing works for a specific organization, quite different from a competitor of that business that does it in their own way. It will definitely unfold the way you just mentioned. But yeah, I don't see our value diminishing here.
No, I actually I think to your point, maybe more a statement than a question, but if more and more information is processed by language models and agents, the information that you will present in a screen or a dashboard or in a system is more important, as so much information needs to be put into one piece or is done in the backend, that what you present needs to be very on point. So I could argue that the aesthetics and the UX in the near future will only be more and more important. And as a person in the loop, the human in the loop needs to be able to work with that. Like typically the iceberg thing, the aesthetics would be even more important. So I would say maybe even from a development perspective, of course, Kishan will argue also that the integrations are still quite complex and the data structures and the processes that we need to translate into code. But I can imagine that in the near future, even more emphasis will be on the aesthetics and the UX because of the agents and the language models.
Yeah, makes sense. I also think, I mean, back to my example of sitting with 18 other people in the boardroom deciding what the product should do. If you mimic that situation, but then with an AI, you get a product that is more like the average of all those opinions, right? So you still need to have a team or a person that knows how to take all that input and turn it into a product that is actually very good. Like if you just listen to all the users and you do exactly what they are saying, then I'm not sure if you get a great product. It's the person or the team that interprets all that information and turns it into something, yeah, something super good. So I don't think that will diminish that quickly, to be honest. So yeah, we're on the same page.
Got it. Great. One last question. We know that before an organization knocks on our door, like 70 to 80% of their research on selecting an agency like Eli5 has been already done. They look at the website, they look at what we have been doing, who we are, our
Mm.
capabilities, etc. In that consideration phase, and maybe like in the 70% consideration phase, but also in the 30% deciding on which agency the organization is going to work with, what would you give them as some of the key questions that you could use to an agency or a product studio actually as Eli5 that we should answer, like we should be able to answer properly in terms of maybe more like focus on the UX and UI and our capabilities on that than on our technical capabilities, because we can prove them also, of course, on what we work
Mm.
on. But are there any things that you can contribute to an organization in sitting on top of like a 15-year-old system with terrible UX and UI? What type of questions would you ask if you were them, and where would you start in the search of replacing that system?
Mm. Okay, that's a good one. Where would I start? I mean, I would start with something that's probably hardest, and that's like you want to make sure that the company you're going to work with understands all the legacy stuff that's already there. And I think if I look at a lot of most product studios don't really have that from what I see. They're like more focused on building things entirely from scratch. Turning a legacy system into something modern requires a bit more than writing proper code, right? So I would first look at that. I mean, we have our CTO Kishan that uh, has a lot of experience with legacy systems. And yeah, it's definitely not the most fun part to do for developers. So there's not that many out there, right? I would definitely look at that first. Then I'd look at like, okay, do you guys already have some IP within this vertical I'm working in? Like is it I don't know, like a tool for a logistics company or a compliance department of a bank or whatever? I would look at like, hey, what's the IP that you guys already have in this vertical that we can leverage? And I would definitely want to have a talk with the person that is going to lead the design and check what their philosophy is on creating something good, for this specific tool. You want someone that listens to all the input that's there, but you still need to have someone that has quite a strong opinion on how things need to be done, but like kind of loosely held. You want the person to be open to all the inputs
Mm-hmm.
and not only go his own way. But if you turn it around, if you have a person that doesn't have very firm beliefs about how things need to be done, and just listens to all the input that the person gets, that the designer gets, and yeah, you also get a bit of an average result. So there's a fine balance there. Most important things I would look at is definitely the understanding of legacy tech, and yeah, what do you guys already have in this vertical that I'm building a product in, and then design. Like I just said, make sure that you got someone good. But I think that's probably the least important one. It's very important, but if you got a good designer, but you got like a team that doesn't understand the legacy tech or doesn't have anything that makes your development time way faster, then yeah, what's the designer work
Right,
then?
right. And especially looking at the internal systems with like single tenant systems, then design is
Mm.
important, but it's not like the most important thing that needs to be working, so to speak. So what's your design philosophy? Because you mentioned like a philosophy that the designer or product designer has. You mentioned it a couple of times already in talks that we had before, but
Mm.
do you have a current design philosophy, and did you adapt that, change it the last few years, or is it still the same?
I like very aesthetically pleasing things. I do love that, but I completely understand that that's not the most important thing. You want things to work very smooth. You want people to understand a product without a whole training video or something. So yeah, definitely focus on that first, how the product works. And aesthetics is something that can come later if you even want to pay attention to that, especially with the internal tool, maybe less important. I also am a big fan of ideating quickly. So, like we just discussed, like use tools like Lovable or Figma Make to spin up ideas very quickly, prototype and test it with your users, test it with the customer. Make sure that you don't lose yourself in that. You don't want to do that for 4 months before you start designing the actual tool. There's a sweet spot. But yeah, I like to go fast. So I'm a big fan of those tools. But focus on how it works. Like if that is efficient and self-explanatory, then I think you got the most important thing checked off.
Agree. Okay, thank you, Wes, for your time, and talk to you later on a different subject.
Okay, then.